different backgrounds.
Hi everyone, my name is Dan, I'm from Brazil.
Hello, I'm Michaela, I'm from South Africa.
I'm Arjun, I'm from Singapore.
And I'm from the United States.
I am from the Philippines.
I'm originally from Yorkshire.
I'm from Shropshire.
I'm from Mexico.
I was born in Washington, D.C., but actually grew up all over the world. I spent 6 years in Cote d'Ivoire, West Africa, and 10 years in Tunisia before going back to the U.S.
I'm from Montreal, so I'm French-Canadian.
I come from Jerusalem, Israel.
You know, we have so many different people from different countries, different nationalities, different ethnicities.
Yeah. I really don't know a country from which I haven't met someone.
It's like traveling around the world a little bit.
Everybody is also from somewhere else.
Yes.
Because it's such an international community.
Yeah. But you get so many more interesting conversations with people from wherever, and you also get really good holidays. I'm going to Jordan next month to visit a wolf.
A wolf.
All right, guys. Welcome to today's Wolfson Entrepreneurs Society event. It's good to have you guys. This is our first event for the Mecommerce term, and we are happy to actually be talking about this very interesting topic, which has to do with funding series. This happens to be the fundamental questions that founders will always want to answer, entrepreneurs, businesses, and what have you. And so we are happy to have people who are well knowledgeable in this field join us today to see how we can kind of decipher this or the mystery around this funding stream and how we can actually tap into them. So the reason I usually try to play the Wolfson video is to show you why actually Wolfson Entrepreneurs Society was formed in the first place. So we have this rich international community here at Wolfson, and you can imagine the ideas, the knowledge that each individual that comes to Cambridge and comes to Wolfson actually brings. So we thought that it would be a nice platform to unite together and then see how we can interact with these people, given the proximity that college life actually gives. And that was actually how the Wolfson Entrepreneurs Society came about. And since then, we've been having series of talks. We've been having a whole lot of breaking sections where we all talk about the ideas we have and then seek for some kind of support from ventures outside Cambridge and within Cambridge to see how those people who have those burning desire to fund businesses, to push their idea to the next level, can actually go about them without much stress. And I'm happy to tell you that it has been fruitful. A whole lot of discussion has happened in the past. People have tapped into what we are doing. And so that kind of encourages us to continue to do what we are doing. And so today we are very happy to have two venture capitalists within us who are going to be talking to us about themselves and then the firms that they represent. And without further ado, I will simply let them to introduce themselves and then we can get started. Daniel, you want to go first?
Yeah, very happy to. It's very nice to meet you all, and thanks, David, for the invite to speak to you and to be engaged in discussions today. I'm really looking forward to it. So I'm Dan Rook. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and founder at StartCodon. I'm a lawyer by background, so please don't judge me too harshly. But fundamentally, many years of being in private practice, advising a whole myriad of different companies, mainly in the tech and healthcare sector, on financings, so all the way from kind of seed, pre-seed, all the way down to Series X and exit, and also prepping for things like IPO. So a lot of that in private practice. I then moved into industry after leaving. Most of my career was spent at Taylor Bessing, which is probably Europe's largest known and certainly one of the most active tech and venture capital law firms. So most of my private practice career there went into industry. So I've been at the forefront of. I joined a biotech, employee number 10. Left when the number of employees was in the 30s, and watched it go from effectively an early stage biotech platform, primarily looking at pharmaceuticals in the rare and orphan disease spaces. And so I've lived through the whole scale up journey, launching of products, been involved in launches of 3 products, helped set up US and European operations, and I did that before starting Start Code on, and co-founding that with my co-founder Jason Miller.
All right, thank you very much. That's really, really interesting to also see that you have a lot of background. So our audience, I would like you to start prepping your questions. We are going to have a few minutes to ask questions that we've received beforehand. And then after a couple of minutes, maybe 30 minutes or 40 thereabout, we'll start taking questions from the audience. So irrespective of any platform that you are, we are streaming live across 3 different platforms, on Twitter, on Facebook, as well as YouTube. So wherever you are, just popping your questions in there. We'll be able to see it there, and we are going to pick it up. So start prepping your questions. You can start bringing those questions in now if you've not been opportune to kind of send them before this event. And so next we move over to Henrik. Henrik, please spend a moment to tell us about your goal.
Awesome. Thanks again, Dave, for having me as well. And great to be involved with you, Daniel, too. So I was at Cambridge myself back in the day, not too long ago. So I graduated in 2017. I was in the red bricks of Robinson, if any of you have ventured to the thing that looks like a car park a little bit outside of the centre. But I did French and Spanish back then. I went straight from that to investment banking, so quite a big leap of faith, but taught me insane amount of technical skills, which is sort of now what I apply at Playfair in particular. Don't judge me too harshly for my investment banking background, just like Daniel in his law background. I can come back to that if anyone has any questions. But along the way, I set up a startup while studying at Cambridge. So that was a kind of very early stage venture. I found a technical co-founder in London to help me build that kind of on the side. I'm happy to go into more detail on kind of the experience there. And started a social enterprise to help students from disadvantaged backgrounds get into places like Oxford and Cambridge as well. And then the kind of final part of my background is sort of crowdfunding. So, while sitting in some occasionally boring lectures, I found my way onto Crowdcube and Seeders, which I'm sure lots of you have heard of. It was relatively new 4 or 5 years ago. Invested in about 40 companies with, pocket money, occasionally just have one less beer and put it into a company on there. So I think for me, it was really about learning how to build a business on the operator side, even if it was very much for an MVP, just getting something going in the background. And then also understanding at a large scale and a broad spectrum of sectors, what sort of traits a business needs to grow and scale, everything from a seed stage investment to maybe a slightly later stage one. So yeah, I'm happy to talk about any of those things in more detail later.
All right, great. I'm happy to see some questions coming in. That means I'm really excited to see how this discussion is going to flow. And so, yeah, it's interesting. Some of the entrepreneurs that I've been opportune to kind of speak to around Cambridge, sometimes some of them will tell you, we want to probably go into consulting, get used to that business word, and then before looking at how to pursue our ventures and all that. So I'm very sure that some people in our audience are also thinking about going into consulting or investment banking to get that idea of how the business world works, how the accounting part of a business is, financial model, and all of that. So it will be interesting to hear your own view on your experience about the investment banking and how you think that has actually helped you at Play Capital at this point. Okay, so thank you very much, Henrik. Without further ado, we are going to move into the next agenda I have on the platform. Now, you've spent a couple of minutes telling us about yourself, and you kind of stopped about you when you got to your company. So both of you just ended at, okay, co-founded Start Code on with Jason, and then you also ended when you joined Play Capital. And the reason you are here today is because of the expertise both of you share with your firms. And I was wondering if you could spend a couple of minutes to give us an overview of what your firm actually represents, the kind of activities you do, and just a broad overview. So this time, maybe we'll start with Henrik.
Yeah, sure. So I think just to maybe give you a bit of history, because I think that really informs kind of the mission behind what Playfair does. The name suggests maybe everything from a betting company to investing in gaming. People don't really understand like why we call Playfair Capital. it literally is play fair by founders. You know, everything we do is for our founders, and we want to be that founder-friendly VC at our very core. It's become a very trendy word recently, but I think since being started in 2013, that has always been our ethos. And what I mean by that is we were founded by an angel investor. He started angel investing back in 2010 before he even set up the fund. And everything that we want to do in the way we work with our founders is strategic, operational, it's hands-on, it's mentorship. It can be on the end of a phone if someone's having a difficult time. Being a founder is an incredibly difficult job, all-encompassing life kind of occupation. So we're really there from the pre-seed, maybe seed stage, kind of all the way through. Everyone on our team has either been an angel, an operator, a founder. So, you know, from hiring, from sales, from marketing, go-to-market, these are all areas that different people on the team, and we're a team of 5, come and help with, depending on how much the founder wants us involved, of course. We're not trying to push anything on people, but we are there to get stuck in. And I think one final point is our founder is actually still our sole investor. So we're in a very fortunate place where instead of our partners running around the world or London or Zooms trying to raise money for our fund, we actually just devote all that time to our founders themselves, which is a super lucky place to be for us. Just in very practical terms, what we invest in technology businesses. We invest totally agnostically, apart from maybe hardware, which is an area we just don't understand quite as well. And actually life sciences is something we don't know quite as well. So an interesting kind of match up with Daniel's fund. But apart from that, we like people first, we like market second, and we like ideas third.
Great, I love that. Like people, the markets, and the idea. And again, I also love the fact that we've brought in 2 different people with respect to the fields where you focus when it comes to what kind of startups and ideas you want to fund. So like you mentioned, later we're going to hear from Dan what they themselves are focusing on. And later I would spend some time to ask you why you've kind of decided to go on those areas. So because it's good that when people are thinking about their ideas, they are looking at, okay, this is the idea I have, and this is how I can actually launch this idea, carry out commercial feasibility study, and then know how to take this idea to the market. But how do I make my idea interesting to someone who is going to give me money? So we are going to look at all that later on. But before then, let's hear from Dan about a brief summary about Start Coding.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Henrik, it's always nice to be on a panel where there's no competing interests in that sense. I think there's some qualitative aspects on the tech side, which we can talk about in a minute. But so Start Coding was set up to in many ways to try and reinvent or do properly, depending on how you want to look at it, the kind of pre-seed and seed stage financings in the healthcare sector in the UK and in Europe. So I think when we were looking at whether, Jason and I were looking to found this and raise money for the idea, we sat there, we thought, right, what's really missing, in our opinion, in the both the local and national ecosystem. And one thing that was blatantly obvious is that there was a funding gap between the very, very early stage tech and then the investors who typically invest at Series A, and that was particularly evident within the life science and healthcare sector. I see there's a great question about capital at an early stage, which we can talk about later, but it was really there to we thought, right, there's a funding gap and we need to address that funding gap, and we can address that in several ways. We can address that with cash, but actually investors, following investors want to see more than cash just going into business, and founders, more often than not at that stage, particularly it's their first venture, they need help and assistance to really get off the ground and to sometimes just focus the ideas. Some people are moving from academic environment into a more commercial environment, and some guidance along the way. So we thought, we looked at the West Coast and the East Coast models, popular kind of accelerators, as it were. And we went out with a view of raising a fund that would also provide business acceleration services. So at Start Coding, we start very early, so pre-seed and seed, healthcare and life sciences sectors only, albeit there's a slight crossing over in terms of more tech side of things. So there's a primary application for the technology in healthcare and life sciences. But that's really to address the really early stage really, really early stage opportunities that seemed we thought were really missing that couldn't make it out of the clinic. So we provide minimum 250k financing. We can go higher than that. Generally speaking, we won't, but we do have the ability if we need to. But we start at a minimum of 250k, and then we do a 6-month intensive acceleration program, and then a kind of 6-month less intensive kind of tail off program. So in terms of the intensive program, what does it involve? So it involves for us, aside from the cash, we have lab and office space in Cambridge at the Miller Therapeutic Institute. We also provide access to the team. So we do weekly scrums with the teams. We get really involved in the day-to-day, the business plan, the strategy. We get a lot of involved in things like hiring and firing, recruitment plans and so on. So really get down the weeds, really intensive for 6 months. Speak to our founders. We have scheduled meetings a week that speak to them quite regularly outside of that. And it's all about really then introducing them to the right partner organizations. We have a long list of partners we work with. We have preferential discount and or other preferred rates with everyone from law firms to accounting firms to banks, CROs, CMOs. And then it's all about providing access to follow-on investors, of which we have some in our fund, mentors. And it's really about, for people who've already got the tech out of, say, the universities or other organizations, it's really about helping them to drive that forward as much as possible in the 6 to 12 month period that they're really with us, and to really help broaden both their network and also enable them to address 3 major issues, I think, in healthcare in particular, which is trying to address how they can better manage their capex, so their capital expenditure, and effectively cash going out of it. Also to address IP issues, and also to address market access issues, because in life science and healthcare they are, I think, particularly hard to address, and so the team has been built up around that. So finally, just to cap off, because I'm conscious of time, there's me. So Dan, I run the operations, legal background. I've got Jason Miller, the ex CEO of Cambridge Epigenetics, and also my co-founder. We have a patent attorney, Secure Holloway. We also have a secondee called Mike Solarco from CR UK in their innovations team. So the idea is access to the team as well as external mentors to really drive that 6-month period forward and make it as useful as we can for the entrepreneurs we work with.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's really interesting. What caught my attention is the fact that you don't just provide the money, but when you do, you still go ahead to provide this mentorship and guidance to make sure that you help these funders see through their founding ideas and then launch it to the market, which is really amazing. I can't emphasize so much about mentorship. Personally, I've been a recipient of amazing mentorship at George Business School through the Enterprise Tech program. And so I understand what it means when you say that you are providing mentorship to founders, in addition to giving them this access to that funding that you provide. So that is really amazing. But before we move into how people can actually access this funding, how the whole thing works, I wanted us to spend a couple of minutes to look at the various funding streams, from the pre-seed, seed, and then before you get into the Series A to E and all of that. I wanted you to spend a couple of time first, because there are some people who had kind of emailed me and they started asking me, what actually does this seed funding mean? I've kind of looked at the internet, but I'm not quite sure. Some say it's a family fund. Some say it's something that your friend has given to you. How do you incorporate this series of funding into, say, the equity of your business and all of that? So I don't know, anyone can actually go first, but I would break it into 2. One person tell us about pre-seed and then seed, and then maybe the other person can talk about from Series A all the way to E. Anyone can just shoot.
It might be useful to slightly separate it between London and Cambridge, and also maybe between healthcare and other areas. So, I might just start on the London side. We invest all across the UK, all across Europe, and sometimes globally, but we are focused in London. And I think there is a very big distinction between the London and specifically Cambridge market, as I'm sure Dan will come back to. I think for us, the way of framing it, which is maybe the most helpful to people listening, is pre-seed and seed is finding your product market fit and building out your early team. It's going from an idea to the beginnings of a business, to an MVP, to your first pilots, your first revenue, it's all very uncertain and ad hoc. And you're basically trying to prove that the market really wants something and build the foundations to get to scalability. Series A onwards, and that's why it's Series A and then letters after that, is basically scaling that. If you've reached that point of product market fit and you've got a potentially successful product, it's then more about execution. That execution is still incredibly difficult, but you've already slightly ticked a few boxes. So I'd almost kind of split it in half there. Obviously, you can go into a lot more detail on any section, but that's maybe a useful starting point. I don't know if you want to speak to it a bit, Dan, and I can come back to a few more details if that's helpful.
Yeah, no, I think Henrik, the distinction you made actually both geographically and focus areas is quite relevant. So I think from our perspective, and we'll look at focus first. So for us, we're based in Cambridge. We will invest from companies based anywhere. So we're not locally restricted. We're not nationally or internationally restricted either. But I suppose we will invest in UK companies. So happy for people to come over and set up a UK company who can invest in that. But we will focus on UK companies for a variety of reasons internally. So look at relocations, but we're not location specific, if that makes sense. We like to bring people to Cambridge because we think it's the kind of biotech and healthcare cluster of Europe, in our opinion. And we think there's a lot of benefits to be brought from bringing people locally, both in terms of their connections and also in terms of the resources that are available. So we do look to do that. We don't require them to stay, but in many ways we do encourage them to look around and work out whether that is the right place to base themselves, on the pure basis that we do think it's the leading place in Europe. So that's, I think, geographically for us in the healthcare and life sciences space, that's kind of how we see the local market. And obviously London you can never ignore, particularly for what Henrik's doing on the tech side. It's the epicenter of Europe. So I think on the healthcare side, it's slightly different. It's not different in kind of how you split it up. I think what is different in healthcare tends to be the amount of capital you need to get a business off the ground, and therefore, when we talk about seed and pre-seed, I don't think in healthcare you're not going to get to a point where you might be, you'll be looking at your proof of concept. So if you've got your typically what will happen is these ideas will have come from a university or from an institution, research will have been done into them, and it's really, people look to spin them out when they've got enough data, when they've got their idea, their proof of concept, down to a T, and at that point you spin it out. In pre-seed and seed, it depends really on how you discuss it and how you flip it in the market. Sometimes they can be the same thing. They just talk about early financings in healthcare. Sometimes people, because healthcare demands a lot of capital to get to the point where it's where actually you can do your research, you get quite deep into the research, and it costs a lot of cash. Some people actually view anything below a couple of million as pre-seed, and then they move the seed on to what some people might consider to be Series A. I think for me, I generally consider pre-seed and seed, pre-seed to be maybe really early cash, so sub a couple of 100,000, something like that. And then seed, I think, starts from about 250K up to maybe, your Series A, which can be, lower millions or several millions. But I think it's, because of how the healthcare sector works, I wouldn't say there's really there's definitely a blurring, put it that way, from the time an organization comes out of an institution.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was actually going to come back to that question in trying to tie the amount of money involved to this series of funding. But I think Dan already beat me to that to explain how that works with respect to healthcare. It would be interesting to know what Henrik have to say with respect to the tech side. What amount of money do you think a founder is going to be looking for? And then you say, okay, because of, for instance, you can say if someone is looking for £1 billion, you wouldn't call that a pre-seed, even if it's the first time he's asking for money. So what do you think is the cap to categorize series of funding according to whether it's pre-seed or Series A or what have you?
Yeah, for sure. I think that because people ask this question in lots of different ways a lot, and I think there's basically three factors here that you need to take into consideration. One is the dilution you're willing to accept for any funding round. to the amount of capital you need, and that is a total factor of what you're trying to achieve. So what are your milestones and what is the time frame? Normally it's an 18 to 24 month time frame, because that gives you enough buffer in case something goes wrong. We've seen COVID, lots of other different things that can happen that means you need that buffer on a micro or macro level. And that essentially helps you figure out what funding you need. So for us, pre-seed is usually pre-product, almost definitely pre-revenue, sometimes even pre-product. And that usually means you need to hire a team, often of engineers, to build a product. So how much does a team of engineers cost for 18 months? Usually comes in around up to 500K. It sort of depends on the product you're building, the size. So that's sort of how an easier way of thinking about it, rather than just a random number. I think for seed, you're probably pre-revenue, you may have a small amount of revenue, so you might start to bring in a few salespeople. You're probably looking at more like 1 to 3 million over an 18-month period. And so that's probably more the range we see. I think Series A, it's shifted a lot recently. So I think depending on what people read online, it will really change from maybe 5 years ago to today. I think the old Series A was like 5 million, 5 to 10. I think now you actually almost do a seed round that's much larger. So seed rounds can be actually extended into the 3 to 5 million range, depending on the fund. It's also a factor of competition. I think a lot of Series A or seed funds are sort of moving into each other's territory and therefore calling the round slightly different things, which is very confusing for founders. But I think just going back to the way I framed it originally, I think just think of the distinction about how far along your company's development you are. I think that's really what the round entails. And for a true kind of scaling round, anywhere between 5 and 15 million, depending on kind of how far you've progressed and whether or not you've raised a larger seed round or you've just raised a pre-seed. That's basically the thing that moves it.
Okay, just another short question, because Dan already mentioned that Start Codon is willing to invest a minimum of 250K. If I'm right, Dan, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So on your own case, so that means that if a founder is looking for money that is probably below 250, probably the person wouldn't be looking at Start Codon. So let's look at Playfair. What is the minimum amount of money that Playfair is willing to invest in ideas?
So we invest between 100,000 and 500,000. And the reason we have that range is because we do invest at the pre-seed to the seed stage. And it sort of depends on the founder we meet and the stage that they're at. If they're at the pre-seed stage and they're only raising 300K, actually you want to bring other angels, you want to bring in other people. We have a very collaborative approach. We think there's a lot of value in having lots of different parties that bring different experience and expertise. So we like to have that flexibility. I think the 500K is when you're doing a more traditional 1.5, 2 million seed round, and we'll put a little bit more capital to play. We're essentially trying to get to a significant enough ownership percentage relative to the round size. So we have that range and we're very flexible on it.
Okay.
I do think, David, that when we talk about, I think there's a relative distinction between healthcare and tech, in the sense of, I think you made the comment there that if a founder's looking for less than 250K, might not be interested in the money from Start Codon. I think if you're going to set up particularly a therapeutics, you're going to set up a healthcare life sciences business, unless it is fundamentally a tech business with a primary focus on healthcare, your burn rates, the amount of cash you'll need to spend early doors, is so significantly higher that actually, in many instances, we didn't, when we were looking at the model for this, we didn't see it being worthwhile to put anything less than 250K. And because actually, as I said, the round sizes on pre-seed, seed, and Series A, they vary vastly in life sciences. I mean, I've done Series A's of 175 million. I've done Series A's of 5 million. So, I think there's some blurring, but I think that the overall point is that if you're in the sectors, particularly if you're looking at therapeutic space product or platform technologies with therapeutic application and things like that, I think you will find that by the time you've got the lab space, you've done the apps, you've sent everything out that you need to do. So, you do some high level experiments. You've got people in the lab. Actually, you've gone through the cash potentially relatively quickly. So, we'd always look to actually syndicate our initial investments to start with other investors to actually give founders more cash at day one, just because the burn rate and the difference in which life science and healthcare companies can use cash can be so fundamentally different.
Okay, that's great. Henrik, you did mention something about Playfair kind of focusing on London area, but before I come to you, Dan also mentioned that they are not actually looking at geography, but they want the business to actually be sited in Cambridge. So Dan, I wanted to ask, let's assume there is someone in, say, France or US or somewhere outside Cambridge, outside the UK, or even in Africa, and this person have got an idea which maybe your company would be interested in kind of investing. What would be the model? Would you have to ask them to kind of open up the headquarters of the business in the UK before you are able to fund it? Or would you just say, okay, for the fact that this business has not been in the UK, you wouldn't be interested? Will you ask them to move that business to UK for you to be able to fund it? But how does that work? Or are you just concentrating on those ones that are already established in the UK?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the relocation piece, we're talking ideal, probably non-COVID times, because it's hard to get people around the table at the best of times nowadays. So obviously there's a virtual element which we've built into the model. The relevance of Cambridge, apart from the fact we're based here, we do have lab and office space there, and we do like to meet people. Restrictions pending. For us, it's just the environment in the healthcare and life sciences sector which is beneficial. So whilst we are not geographically limited, we would encourage people to relocate. It's not a requirement, but it's we would encourage it just because it will help in terms of their exposure. In terms of answering your specific question about whether we would need them to move the business to the UK, so the answer is it's a complicated one. We need an English, what we call an English topco. So it tends to be when you've got an entity abroad. It's a legal entity in that jurisdiction. What you can do is you can put an English top company at the top, so it's a wholly owned subsidiary. Yes, we would require that, or sometimes founders, depending on where they are in their business and where they're spinning out from, because sometimes we get many people approach us where they haven't actually spun out of the institution and they're starting that process. So in that instance, you can set up a UK company, and we can invest into that if the IP is in there. Now, if you've got anyone you're employing abroad, you've got to work through quite a few issues in terms of where they get paid, what happens in relation to applicability of things like local laws and so on. But yes, so the answer is we would need an English company to invest in. Would we require them to physically relocate? No. There are benefits for doing that in the region. But there's also relevance here for future investors in the sense of you can't underestimate when you go for future fundraising rounds, how you want founders to be committed, you want them to be engaged, you want them to be in the right place with the right connections, because it's going to impact the money that you put into the business as well as their shareholding. And so, what tends to happen is in the early days, you put the money in, you have a UK co. If they have to stay, and use the example of Africa or France, we've looked at both. For that instance, you wouldn't normally. You require them to relocate, but at some point, the investor is going to ask a question of, if the business is being developed, depends where the business is being developed, where the real headquarters are. But if you are a virtual business and actually you're generating a lot of the work in Cambridge, there's going to be pressure on founders at some point to consider a relocation, just so they're near the epicenter of where they need to be. So I think the answer is not strictly, but it's a discussion piece to be had both in terms of the short-term plans and the longer-term plans of the company and the founders, and that's something we're happy to engage in early doors. And it will either work out, and we're happy to make the investment, or it won't. But we don't require people to be relocated physically here at the start, and certainly not in COVID times.
All right, great. That's good to know, because a couple of questions have actually coming through email to me on that, and I'm happy to see what your response is with respect to that. And so over to Henrik. Henrik, you mentioned about London. So now I guess my own question to you is going to be in two ways. One, is it mandatory that the business has to kind of have its office or whatever in London? So which means if it's a business within the UK but not in London area, would you require them to come into London before you invest in them? And then the second is, if it's not in the UK, just like I've asked Dan, would you be interested in kind of funding such an idea? And if yes, what would you require them to do?
Yes, actually, it's a relatively easy answer because we invest in any company globally, to be honest. They can be based anywhere. They can have a remote team. I think from memory, across Fund 1 and Fund 2, we'd invest in 14 countries. The caveat to that is that we probably wouldn't be a lead investor. And I come back to that term outside of the UK, at least until we have 1 or 2 investments in that country. So we partner with a lot of other funds that will lead in those countries, and then we'll come alongside, still be active to the extent we can, but ultimately we won't know France or Israel or Nigeria, all of where we've invested, as well as a local fund. So we really value their input. I personally led a deal in France this year. We loved investing there. I think actually these days the geographic barriers are so much smaller, both on the sales side and the hiring side. People can have fully remote teams now. So I think it's basically that point of, do you have that local knowledge, either yourself or through a partner? And apart from that, great people are everywhere. So we don't like sort of separating by geography.
Okay, that is great. I think the conversation we've been having now, we've been able to actually answer 2 questions, which is how the whole of this works, and then when to think about them, how to assess this funding. So the next thing I want to try to answer is how to prepare to assess them. And so to answer that, the way I want to frame the question is, if an idea is presented before you, what are you looking for to say a yes, that you want to fund this idea? Maybe we can go, Dan, you can go first. Okay, Henrik, you can go first, feel free.
Yeah, sure. So I think there are so many factors here. We could go on probably forever, but I think just to try and distill it to something that everyone can remember. I talked about at the beginning our 3 kind of in order priorities of founder, market, idea, or product. I think that really is the key. I think the founder needs to show that they are either the best or the most passionate about an area, and they will continue to be in some form. So that's it feels very waffly, but either that founder has to have some domain experience other people do not have, or a combination of experiences through what they studied and through what they've worked on, but then also their market research that's gone behind the idea. That is really crucial. The French company I just alluded to, it's called Koala. It's in the travel claims space. Those founders are only 24, but they've already built a 3-year-old claims business, and they are obsessed about travel claims. They literally spend all their weekends looking up how to refund passengers who get screwed over by Ryanair. And look, personally, that doesn't set my world on fire. I don't get up on a Sunday and say I need to solve this problem, but it does get them up on a Sunday morning, and they are obsessed by it. And so, that leads to so many other good things. And to build a business for 10 years with the intensity it requires, to build a VC-backed business at the scale that a VC requires, you need that passion driving it. So I think that's number 1. And so I'd say to any prospective founder, just to really reflect on whether or not this is the right journey you want to be on. There are lots of other ways of building a business, and there are lots of other ways of executing on a good idea that don't require that level of commitment. And then part 2 and 3 in terms of market and product. I think on market, just have done your research, make sure that you can inform an investor, because, we're a generalist investor, so we will have a little bit of knowledge on lots of markets, but we shouldn't be more of an expert than you, at least not until we've done our DD. And then on the product and the idea, it all comes down to getting a sense of product market fit. You don't need to prove at our stage, at pre-seed and seed, that the market absolutely wants this and they're willing to pay X, Y, Z. But to give some indication that there is a pull, not a push here, that the market wants this, that people are signing up to your waiting list, that you have pilots engaged already, that people are actually willing to pay for it and allocate budget, whatever it is, engagement on an app, etc. So I think those are kind of the fundamentals. And beyond that, it's about, working smart, having kind of smart preparation. So you can go into a meeting and the person across the table from you, the investor, has confidence that that founder knows more than them, and they are all over the detail, even if they're not necessarily going through it all in a 1 hour meeting.
Okay, that's great. That's great to hear. But because of time, I will just move over to Dan and see what Dan has to say. When you are looking at an idea, a pitch deck that someone has sent you to look at in order to decide whether you have to fund, what are you looking for?
It won't come as a surprise. It's very similar to what Henrik summarised. I mean, for us. So I always, used to lecture on the BVCA, some of the BVCA courses, the British Venture Capital Association courses. And they always used to say, an interesting analogy I used to put to investors was, if you had an amazing product, but a very average set of management team of founders, or an average product, but an amazing set of management team, what would you do? What would you fund? It was almost exclusively the case that you would back the founders who are excellent with the average product. And the reason I mention that is because, for us, the technology is important, but the people, as Henrik said as well, are equally important. And you've got to, so first choice, again, just repeating Henrik, is to really be engaged with the founders, to find the founders who really want to drive this business and the technology forward, and are really passionate about it, and are going to be committed. And the commitment's key. And in healthcare and life sciences, you can have a slight difference with tech in the sense of some of the founders can be PIs, they can be very senior academics, and actually they will keep that role. And therefore, you've got to have that committed founder, regardless of whether they're going to keep an existing role for a shorter period of time or a longer period of time, as the case may be. So the right team with the right focus, and the right people involved at the early days, with a view of then scaling that up is first and foremost. Second is disruptive technology. So sometimes in healthcare and life sciences, people don't know. I don't think they know what they need in terms of the market doesn't know what it needs until the disruptive technology has been out there. So it's really looking at whether technology could potentially be disruptive in the market, and whether it could change, primarily change how patients are treated and be transformative to their lives. So the technology and the transformative, disruptive element of the tech is hugely important for us, alongside the right founding team. And then again, just repeat the kind of the trifecta of important points. It all then comes down to the fact of you've got your product. What are you trying to look at, and also what is the market that you're trying to fix? And they're really important because if you're going to go into a heavily fished market even with a new technology, don't assume that just because it's better technology that people are going to move over to it, particularly if you've got treatments which are saving people's lives. People trust, people have been on medications for years. So it's really about doing the competitive analysis and the market fit and working out where you're going to be, and the other matters I mentioned.
Okay, thank you very much. I think building on what you've said, disruptive, just out of curiosity and setting the pace for people to start understanding how to shape their ideas, because sometimes you see someone has an idea which take the form of ABC, but over the months there has been series of iterations. ABC could become CAB. You must have reformed it one way or the other. So out of curiosity to understand how people could actually reform their idea in order to solve certain problem within the society, I wanted to ask both of you, you have separate areas that you are funding. I know people can decide to fund different areas, but I want to believe that there is a reason why companies decide to fund a particular type of project and not fund the other type of project. Could you share some insights on one? For instance, Start Codon is kind of focusing on life sciences. Is there something extraordinary that has made you to start focusing on that? And then the same thing for Henrik.
So in terms of Start Codon and its focus and why we've gone down the disruptive technology route, for us, we've always been pretty close to the healthcare sector and life sciences sector as a group of people, albeit in different specialisms, whether that be most of the people have had prior lab experience. People like me have done a lot of work for healthcare companies before, but for us, it was really to address the funding gap because we knew there was a lot of really amazing technologies which could benefit patients, which just weren't seeing the light of day. So we spent a lot of time helping companies spin out of institutions in order to get that new technology, that disruptive technology, which could really benefit patients out into the open. So I think that's primarily. I think it's answering your question. That's primarily what we're looking to do, or what we're looking to fund, and why we're here. It's just really with a view sort of finding those technologies, and those technologies can be in a whole host of different applications. We have a bias towards platform technologies because, as you say, business plans will change, they will pivot, and what a founder thinks they're going to have at day one will not be what they end up at day 365. And so, we look for a technology that can be applied across multiple levels, and that we can work with if the markets change, such as with COVID, or you always find that competitors launch into spaces and it changes the dynamics. So it's all about we have a bias for platform technologies on that basis that allows people to pivot. But yeah, I mean, for us, it was really getting into the market to see whether we could bring out that new technology for the benefit of patients and other people really early on, because we just didn't feel that some of the really, really, really great science that was being done, particularly in the UK, was getting the light of day.
Okay, that is fantastic. Henrik, how does that go for you?
So I think it brings together a lot of what I was saying. I won't repeat too much of it, but just to kind of bring all these key points together, I think for us, we invest in founders who have deep technology more on the software side. So I think deep tech is a term that's bandied about a lot. I think if you mention it in Cambridge, it probably means either hardware or life science. And if you bandy it around in London, it probably means software engineers. And so we're more on the software engineer side. I think what we fundamentally believe as an ethos of our investment strategy is we believe in the power of the founders and the people, but we also believe in the future of technology and the future of technology to create a defensible, sustainable business that is genuinely transformative over and above, say, a direct consumer brand or just a mobile app. That is very hard to defend against and is very hard to pick a winner. So that is sort of what it comes down to. In terms of our approach, we are relatively hands-on and we love actually helping our founders build their businesses. So that's why we're at the stage we are. That's why we like backing people across industries, because we believe that a founder should come in the door and change our view or opinion of a market or a status quo or an assumption. And then it's our job to sort of do the catching up and believe in them and back them. So yeah, that's maybe adding a little bit of extra color.
Okay, that's great and good to know. So I've got just 2 questions to ask, and then we can dive into the questions that the audience are already sending in, so we can have time to take care of them. And so the second to the last question I have is, how do people reach out to you? If I'm interested in your funding, how do I approach you? Through what means?
So for us, you might have got a sense of it, but we want to be fundamentally open and very transparent. So I haven't been around long enough in venture to necessarily know firsthand how it used to be done, but there have been plenty of horror stories for me to feel like I do. And I think the venture capital industry has a tendency to have relatively inflated egos, quite a small, opaque ceiling. The ceilings are very different kinds for people of different backgrounds, from your network, et cetera, et cetera. So we really genuinely believe in trying to promote access to all. We don't believe in warm intros. We obviously take some, but we also take cold inbound, and we have a website where anyone can pitch us. We make it very clear what the criteria for Playfair are. We have a guide on how to submit that form in the best possible way. And I, with another person on the team, review it every single week on a Friday, and then we take calls with, I think it probably is about 10% of the applications on it. So that's kind of one step towards removing that barrier. I think another one on the female founder side, which is ultimately half of the world population, or maybe not quite founder population yet, but hopefully soon. We run this massive female founder office hours event. We're now in our 4th edition, which is happening in a couple of weeks. The last one had 200 female founders join it, I think 60 investors. And that is basically with the goal of creating a level playing field so that, you know, female founders, first of all, have access to the investment community, not just in London, across the UK, but then also have that mentoring and support so that if they're not quite at the level yet, they can be. Because that's a key factor. It's not just, you know, can you pick and choose the diamonds that are just sitting there? Can you actually sort of sculpt, you know, something that's a little bit rougher and needs that little bit of extra support to get to, you know, their potential? So I think those are kind of our 2 key focuses on that front. And hard to always measure your impact, but I think if you think you're doing the right thing, then hopefully you will.
Okay, that's good to know. So to our viewers, you can see the news feed. That's a Playfair website. You can go there to get more information about everything Playfair. But before I move over to Dan, I just wanted to confirm, does your funding stream, the application, does it have a cycle, or anyone can just shoot you email or complete the form at any point in time?
Yeah, so our website, we've got a relaunch actually coming up, excitingly so, in a few weeks. So the website was put up there I didn't make this clear at the start. So we only invested at the start of this year. So we raised our fund at the start of this year. So we've got a relatively modest portfolio of 5 at the moment, with several more in the pipeline. But you know, we're here for the next 4 years at least, and we'll look into another 40 investments. So investments in 40 different companies. So for us, our website's getting a revamp at the moment. So it's and it will be significantly more developed and have significantly more content in due course. But there's an application form on there. That's the primary way to get across. For several reasons, really, for us. You know, we do, like Henrik said, for his fund, you know, we do look at warm intros, but we prefer to analyze them through the application form. The application form is relatively set form, and it breaks it down into questions that we want to kind of see the answer to. So kind of, you know, what's the team, what's the product, what's the solution, you know, a bit of stuff about whether people have thought about the competition and so on. That will be slightly changed in due course, but it's really the primary focus and the primary way to get in contact with us, because then it goes through our team, which is managed by a lady called Sakura Holloway, who's our qualified patent attorney as well. And then we, you know, in terms of what we do, Sakura will make and her team will make contact with people who apply, whether it's successful or whether at that point in time, based on the application, it's you know, potentially not yet. And then it's a question of Sakura and her team will pick up the phone, we'll start to schedule interviews with founders, get more information, and then we proceed from there. Really, at the right time, you know, we'll discuss whether it's appropriate to enter into confidentiality arrangements. And then it's a really case of taking it through there. So definitely the best way is through the website, just because it follows a very objective process based on our criteria that enables us to actually filter the opportunities as best we can. And then we have the various events that people can log on to on our various social media channels. And you know, if they want any more help and advice or anything like that, you know, there's quite a lot of information on there, and there will soon be quite a lot of extra information on the website when the new one is up and running, which are all really for the benefit of founders. So looking into things like exploring, you know, terms, what they mean, trying to explain and simplify what the relatively scary venture terms can be.
So I'm right to think that anytime I go to your website, I'm free to complete this application. There is no cycle. Right. Okay, good. Thank you very much. So the last but not the least question is going to kind of pivot from what we've been discussing. So until now, we've been looking at businesses, entrepreneurs, founders, and then seeing how they can interface with getting that money to fund their business. But now the last question I wanted to ask, because a couple of guys have actually reached out to me, these are people who think that they have the money to invest in ideas, but they are not VCs. They want to see themselves as investors. They might not have what it takes to start looking at the due diligence and try to look at the words of these ideas, and they were wondering if it's possible, if there is a way for them to bring in their money through probably StartCon, or maybe by giving StartCon some money to invest in businesses, or giving Playfair, or what have you. So how does that work? How do you work with investors, people who's got money to invest in idea but wanted to invest it through you? Is that a thing? And if it's a thing, how does it work with your firms?
Yeah, so from our point of view, so we have a typical venture fund structure. So what tends to happen in those venture funds is you raise the fund, that then has an investment cycle and effectively an exit cycle, depending on, and that exit cycle is how long, depends on what industry you're in and how long you agree with your investors for that to be, because we'll have to go and raise funds as well as part of that. So from our perspective, when the fund's closed, the fund is closed, and we don't reopen the fund. That's for a whole variety of reasons. So what we look at, if people want to invest in the companies that we look at, is we look to actively look to syndicate our investments, which I think Playfair, Henrik said that is a strategy that they actively look at as well. That's great for us because it means there's other investors at the table. In terms of looking at the founders, it's often great for them because they always need cash, and so it's about the rights. It's about that gives them access to cash, and then it really comes down to personality fit, I think, because we like to align ourselves as closely as we can with the founders and really work with them, and we'll look at co-investment opportunities if people want to work with us. And we want to work with them, then we'll invest. In terms of co-investors, it's more than just about cash. It's about ability to follow on. It's about whether they're the right fit, whether there's also whether they, if they want to be involved, or they want to have some information and more involvement in companies at a high level. It's really about fit and a whole variety of things. But happy to explore, to answer the question, co-investment opportunities. Wouldn't invest through StartCode on itself. In venture funds tend to raise a new fund broadly every 5 years. You do find different funds out there, like seed enterprise investment scheme funds and enterprise investment scheme funds. They tend to get money from private investors, broadly on a kind of 18-month plus cycle. So they raise cash a lot more frequently because they have to dispose. Some raise every year. It's worth people looking at if they want to invest cash and they want to, talking to financial advisors who can put them in contact with people who are raising money for those kind of schemes, with the caveat, of course, that those schemes are designed for people who can benefit from EIS and SEIS relief, so effectively UK tax resident people.
Okay, thank you very much. Henrik, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I think on the ability for individual people to invest in venture funds, I think that's relatively rare. So we have a single LP. That literally means there is one person. So it's not really something that's possible at Playfair. But I don't think there are very many venture funds where that is the case. I think my experience with crowdfunding is probably the kind of closest you get to that at the moment. And I would really encourage, I don't know the background of the question or the people asking it, but I would encourage them to test that as a starting point, because that basically gives you in miniature what you would do as a venture capital investor and gives you a sense of the exposure you'd be getting. Everything from reviewing a pitch deck to reviewing some basic financials to sort of engaging with the founders on the discussion boards, which are all public. So no one actually knows whether or not you're an angel or you're testing it, you're a student. You just post anonymously and you can sort of be that armchair engaged investor. So I'd highly recommend that. You could also invest in publicly listed venture funds. So I think Draper Esprit is one that works at the kind of Series A onwards, relatively agnostically stage. Augmentum FinTech in the sort of Series A, B FinTech space has also listed. So you can basically invest like a normal stock or share and get some exposure through that. So there are a few ways in which the industry is being diversified, but relatively difficult to get into, your classic fund structure, I think.
Okay, that's good to know. So I think now we can actually start taking some of the questions that are coming from our viewers. And the first question is actually coming from Abba Gega. He said, can entrepreneurs that have no capital or have no experience but do have a blue ocean product be considered as worthy investment? I don't know who want to take this. I think this kind of links to what we just talked about, really, if I understand this question.
I suppose my question maybe back to Arbo would be, what exactly do they mean by blue ocean product, and what do they mean by no experience? So I think when I was talking about the first most important thing of what we look for in a founder, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to have worked in XYZ industry for 20 years to have that career experience. But if they don't have that, then they need to prove that they have expertise in the market they're working in. So I think in terms of sort of CV points, that's fine, but you need to prove that you have some obsession or some way in which you know more or are able to continue learning more than your average person about the area you're hoping to disrupt, essentially. I think to the capital point, totally fine. Everyone's got to start somewhere. So just because you have no capital, that doesn't matter. Yeah, you've got to find the right fund that is willing to invest at that riskier stage. And then I suppose if they're talking about blue ocean product as a massively disruptive idea that is yet to be proven, I think that's fine too, as long as there is a roadmap and maybe a beachhead to start off with. And by beachhead, I mean maybe a slightly smaller niche problem and solution that points towards a much larger business down the line, but you can prove it with this kind of smaller use case to begin with.
Okay. So then I don't know if you have anything to chip in, or maybe we can go to the next question.
No, I mean, from my perspective, Henrik's answered that really articulately. I think if we're talking about no experience in the sense of not a serial entrepreneur, so just build on Henrik's comments of you need to be really into what you're doing. But if we're talking about no experience from an entrepreneur's perspective, so not done it before, that's absolutely not an issue for us. Again, so long as the founder is really committed to what they're doing, the idea. And again, blue ocean, I'm assuming, is effectively a disruptive, completely new disruptive product with no competition, a bit like when you refer to blue ocean strategies and things like that. Then that's absolutely the kind of people we want to get in contact with us. Serial entrepreneurs are good in the sense that they've done it before, they have ideas. Sometimes if they've done it so long before, actually you can find that some people can be relatively fixed in their way, and there's sometimes an investor end, it's important to diligence your investor as much as it is for the investor to diligence the people, and sometimes that means they're not the right people. So from our perspective, entrepreneurs, no capital doesn't matter. Experience, if it's no venture experience, doesn't matter. It's really about the desire for them to do it and the technology. And if those two come together on the right terms, then we're absolutely interested in hearing from people.
Okay, that's cool. I hope Abba, is kind of clear on that. So the next question is coming from Miriam, which says, what are the best sources of seed funding for social ventures and social enterprise? So I know that, you guys are not into any of this, but I was wondering if you have an idea of where Miriam could start looking at for social ventures and social enterprise.
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, social enterprises are great. As I said, it's not something that we fund because we are a for-profit investor. We need to make a return to our investors, in addition to ensuring we do so in the right way. From our perspective, if you look at social ventures, social enterprises, there are charity investors out there who are really happy and willing to look at social venture products, social enterprises. You do find some investors, actually, just not charity-based investors, who will also invest in social ventures and social enterprises. There's been a big push in the industry to look at social, economic, and governance-based companies, and some of those are social ventures, social enterprises for the better. So there are people who invest in it. It's probably a smaller set, and then other places that you can also look for non-dilutive grant funding to help fund those type of businesses. Again, depends on what sector you're in. It's hard to be specific, but there are people who provide grant funding out there, and there's also other institutions, so universities, other institutions based, depending again on the area, who are interested in funding those things. So people, there are people out there in institutions like universities, University of Cambridge, does a few of this. They invest for impact, not for profit. And they are a source of funding if they think actually that the impact and the result of the investing will be good for both the local and or national economy and or a subset of people. So I think there's plenty of people out there. It's just a case of doing the research based on the sector you're in and what your focus is, and then taking it from there.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, because of time constraint, maybe Thurm, if you can move to the next question. Okay, this one is also on biotech. I guess it's coming back to Dan as well. So biotech is expensive. Where do you find our amount of capital at the early stage?
God, it's a big question. So biotech is expensive, really expensive. So where do you find the high amounts of capital? The answer is you might not find high amounts of capital unless you've got a product which has been significantly developed in a lab and just for whatever reason hasn't spun out. As I said, I mentioned the really large 175 million Series A. That was a product that had been in a lab for years. So the answer is in the early days, you find people like Start Codon, some university tech transfer officers provide funding. There are other investors who invest really early, SEIS and EIS funds because of the tax breaks. You find less investors in healthcare and life sciences because it takes a longer period of time to realize an investment than you do in tech. But you will find investors out there who will do that. And again, there are charity investors who will come in relatively early. In terms of early stage, in the seed, the kind of pre-seed and seed stages, it's a bit more difficult in the early days. You tend to need to get to a more of a developed proof of concept, have some in vivo data and so on. But then actually you'll find if you get to kind of the early Series A style, which is still early stage in my book. At that point, there are many investors who can write big checks. At that point, you're going to have some pretty strong data sets to back up what you want to do, and you're going to have to thought through things like your business plan and strategy, your time scales, your routes to market, and things like that. But it is entirely possible. But the really early doors, people like us, SEIS investors, tech transfer officers, and also please don't ignore non-dilutive grants. Innovate UK, places like that can provide some substantial amounts of match funding. Government entities, local bodies. That can be really, really helpful. Non-dilutive to founders. Some of the terms are great, and actually, it really help get the capital injection that you need really early on.
Okay, that's interesting. I think the next question is really interesting, and I would really want to see what both of you have to say, because this is something that I personally have actually thought about. With respect to my idea. So maybe this time around we can start from Henrik. How should a founder evaluate an investment offer? E.g., how do you know if X% equity is reasonable for Y pounds investment?
Sure. So I think this is really a range, but for me and for Playfair, there really is a sort of upper limit because an entrepreneur's time and commitment over a 5-10 year period towards exit should definitely be supported by that exit value and the commitment they're putting into the company. So really be careful about how much equity you're giving away, particularly at the early stage because of the compounding effects. But to put some numbers on it, we would never offer a term sheet for more than 30% dilution for a founder. And then on top of that, there might be an option pool of 10%. So that would be the absolute maximum in our view. It may be different within the kind of healthcare, life sciences world because of the capital intensity. But for us, that is sort of the limit to enable a founder to be properly incentivized, which ultimately feeds back to the investor, because if a founder has too little at Series A or B stage, they're not going to be fully committed and they might look for an early exit. So in reality, as I mentioned at the start, you want to figure out how much capital you need to achieve the milestones. Then that should, factoring the dilution, come out with a sort of valuation. And I think a VC who is offering anything above that really needs to be able to justify to you as a founder why they need to dilute the company and you as a founder or you as founders so much. And I think if the if the fund cannot justify that, they simply want to get a better equity financial deal for themselves, that's a massive red flag.
Okay, that's great. Dan, what do you have to say with respect to life science and what you've done?
Yeah, I can't emphasize how much what Henrik's just said is relevant. We've got no interest in funding businesses where either co-investors or people who help spin out the entity who are not the founders have a substantial part of a substantial portion of equity. What happens actually later down the rounds, because you do tend to see a moderate dilution in healthcare at Series A in particular, because you tend to see quite high multiples for what is still relatively early stage tech. And so, there's no, from our perspective, so we take a different model. We don't, because of how we are as a fund. So we take 8% fully diluted up front. So fully diluted means including option pools. We take that for a nominal amount, which is a very similar model to what the Y Combinators and other West Coast, East Coast VCs who run accelerators do. And then we invest our money through an advanced subscription. We call it a SAFE. It's a simple agreement for future equity. So that is effectively just an agreement that converts into equity on a future fundraise. So it's not a loan. There's no interest rate. We've got no ability to get it back. It just converts a future valuation of a company, subject to some caveats. But ultimately, we don't value the round early doors beyond taking the 8%, which is effectively an acknowledgement of the fact that we tend to spin a lot of entities out, and we spend a lot of time doing that. And therefore, for us to be able to dedicate that time, and that can take anything between 3 to 9 months worth of work. That's kind of what we take at the early doors, but we take ordinary shares. So to answer the question, how do I think you should evaluate an investment offer? Look at the percentage, depending on whether the round is priced or not that you're giving away. I think Henrik's 30% is a really good barometer of measure, so sub 30%. Look at whether the investor wants to take preference shares or ordinary shares. We take ordinary shares, which are the standard shares in the company that issue to founders, because we think it aligns ourselves with founders. And I think there's been a movement in the market for early stage investors to not take what are called preference shares, so shares that rank in preference to founders. And then it's really then about whether there are any other odd terms that attach to the equity. You need to consider director and board appointment rights as part of that. It's not unusual for investors to ask for those. It's a relatively powerful position. And then it's all about control. Investors tend to have things called veto rights in their investment agreements, which they're designed to just stop founders making very material decisions without getting consent. And then you have a separate set of which are board consent matters. And I think investors they should have a reasonable overview of what's going on, because the founders are going to be spending the investors' money, and therefore there's an interest in making sure that money is spent appropriately. But it's not designed to be a bar to innovation investment. And I think I have seen lists where you've got 100 consent matters. I think things like that, when they pop up, show the investor wants too much control. The investor should be primarily focused on making sure the money's spent well and stopping major decisions being made, and decisions which are relative to the amount of money being invested. Where investors start to get really, really detailed on the terms, really want to control everything the board does without consent, that would be a massive red flag to me as well, because that indicates they're either not confident in their own ability or they're not confident in the founders. Either situation, they shouldn't be investing in the first place.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
That's great. I think that kind of even adduces my own kind of worry when I think about that, looking at the valuation of my idea and what kind of how much the amount of ordinary shares that I have to earn to control larger amounts of the equity for the business, and what the investor should take. I think, both of you are really explain it in details, the way that it suits me personally, and I'm sure that Dan, that you are watching, and that also answers your questions and actually also gives an idea of how that can be approached to other audience that are viewing. So Tom, let's go to the next question. Yeah.
Could I just say one more thing very quickly? Sure. We're involved in a lot of spin-outs with organizations, and sometimes you see organizations when they spin out where they want to take even maybe 50% of the shares. For us, that is a big red flag, and that's just through the spin-outs. That's not an investor. That's just organisations, maybe universities as a whole, because all universities have got different policies, and certainly the University of Cambridge actually is really pragmatic on the early equity stake. But there are universities and there are some organisations that say 50% or you don't get spun out. Massive red flag as well. Just wanted to highlight that. That's something we would work with founders to try and get down, because there's no interest in funding an organisation where the founders lose 50% at the outset. So it's really, really important to us. Just wanted to flag it. Sorry for interrupting.
All right. No, that's great. That's great. Okay, so the next question, Mojo is addressing this to both of you. I say, when you are performing due diligence, what are the major red flags that will stop you investing in a startup?
I think the thing about red flags is you don't know what they are until you found them. So it's quite hard to be general on this, but I think a red flag really is something that you discover after a certain number of meetings that was unexpected or not revealed before. So I think to avoid this, just try and be upfront with an investor early on. I mean, in our opinion, the best investors should be accommodating and understanding of areas that you haven't perfected yet, particularly at the pre-seed and seed stage. We are not expecting you to have answers to everything. We are not expecting you to have revenue and pilots and amazing teams already. Hopefully you have some of them, but we're investing on strengths, not lack of weakness. I think what is particularly worrying is when you get 2 or 3 meetings down the line and you ask something just to clarify and suddenly you get a totally different answer, or you dig a little bit into something and suddenly there isn't anything to back it up. So I think don't be tempted to kind of reuse a phrase that's overused in the venture capital world of fake it till you make it. Don't actually fake it. Just be a little bit more transparent. And obviously you want to be a salesperson, but don't go too far in doing that.
Okay, that's great. Dan, what would a red flag mean to you?
Yeah, so for us, we get a lot of people approach us where they don't have the IP in the company. Not an issue in the sense of if there's an ability to get that IP out of the institution or work with people to and the founders to do that. But people saying they've got the right to do something when they haven't negotiated the terms of the spin outs that actually don't actually have the IP. It's one we come across a lot. It's something we like to know about in advance, because it will come out when we go into the diligence phase. It's always nice to be upfront about that and what discussions are having. Something that's also relevant is if you find out there's been prior disputes with the founders or between founder teams, someone's left. Sometimes that's entirely innocent. Sometimes it's indicative of a pattern of behavior from certain people, and it makes you a bit worrisome. Other than that, people, you get to a point in negotiations where you enter into confidentiality, and you're bound by that confidentiality. That, I would always encourage founders to be, you certainly don't want, when you're dealing with partners as an investor, you don't want to see the company giving out the secret sauce to counterparties. Equally, there has to be enough information for someone to evaluate it. And for us, we've had instances where people have applied to us saying they can do X, Y, Z, and then there's no data supplied, and the requests keep coming, and there's nothing to actually back up it, the substance. So for us, because we come in so early, a bit like Playfair, it's really about, if you've got a major issue state in advance, you don't have the data, and that data has been generated, then you're better off just saying that, because we're far more likely to say, we like your idea, you don't have the data yet, but let's reassess, because you're not at the right stage, rather than saying you've got all the data, drag it along, and then realize you don't have it, and you might not have it for 18 months, because that just doesn't create the right trust to start with. And you think, it always puts in the back of your mind, if someone isn't going to be honest with you to start with, then what's going to happen later down the line?
Okay, that is really great. Mojo, I hope that kind of addresses your question. I'm going to look at this question, and I have been preparing a COVID-related question for the final bit of this session. And someone has beat me to ask that. So I'm going to ask both of you, but let's start from Daniel, as the question specifies. How are you helping life science startups navigate COVID-related market access challenges? both from a funding and advice standpoint?
So I guess the first question is it depends what is meant by COVID related market access challenges, because I mean for us, when we get involved so early that market access is just a part of the business strategy in terms of how you will get there, and they're often many years away from that actually happening. So in terms of the strategic side of the market access, because that's all it is really when we involve, we're involved. It's really just about planning the business plan and looking at them and helping them find out areas where they can find cushion, robustness, where they might need to do things like extra experiments and so on. In terms of the COVID related issues on the ground, that's a bit different. We've found that things like lab access isn't as available as it was. People having to manage, numbers in the labs, numbers in the building. We will therefore either look to leverage our partner network or provide, companies with access to our lab space for maybe longer than we would normally, depending on what the company is in question. But at least looking to help them out where we can on the ground to manage things like the cash flow, to keeping them virtual, to finding ways that they can reorganize their budget. But in terms of the market access piece, for us, it's really at this stage, it's really about strategy and working through the observation we've had in the market and how we think that we can best help them develop their strategy such that if another pandemic was to hit, they would be able to deal with that as appropriate as possible. Because we're not there at the market access stage yet in terms of our companies. I can answer that separately, by the way, if someone wants to reach out, because I've had to deal with things later down the line related to market access challenges. And things like everything from reimbursement to applying to the FDA. But for us at this stage, it's all strategy.
Okay, that's good. I just would want to also add to that question by maybe moving over to Henrik to ask how COVID has actually impacted Playfair, both in terms of your funding decisions and your funding stream and the overall system, what you're doing and what you're not doing.
Absolutely. So for us, we've actually been busier and made more investments since COVID started than we did before. And I think for us, we're in a lucky place where investing in tech first companies that do not have many of the capital restraints that maybe are in Daniel's world, not always, but sometimes, means that actually remote first teams are much more accessible and, if anything, growing in their kind of presence within the deals we see. So, we've been able to actually almost open up a much broader pool for investments that we're looking at, and broken down some of those barriers of before, that investment in France. We still haven't met those founders in person. Before, we would have had to go to Paris probably a couple of times, multiple people on the team to feel comfortable. Now we've realized that we don't have to do that to feel comfortable and to back them. So that's been brilliant. I think a slightly separate point on, COVID that is it influences our investment decisions as well, is that there's actually a brilliant hiring market for many startups in many sectors at the moment, because the world has changed. Some people for the worse obviously have had to move jobs or been let go, but it's created opportunities as well, and it's created more, it's removed some of the friction and the risks of jumping around. And so we've never seen such a strong hiring market for many of our kind of pre-seed, seed stage companies, particularly if the company itself is embracing a kind of remote first strategy. So I think if you're building product at the moment, you're actually in a very strong place, because you can be heads down and you can hire that talent. And you're sort of hoping that the sales side will come back within the next 12 months, or you don't even necessarily need it if it really is software.
Okay, that's great. Dan, how has COVID affected Start Coding?
Yeah, so the answer is it's not affected us or our companies much at the moment. I think when the COVID outbreak hit, you could definitely see a reluctance in some investors and how they would approach investments. So there's a battening down of investors investing in their own portfolios. So for later stage opportunities, it was possibly the case that there wasn't as much funding going out there. I think for us at the stage we're at, we haven't seen a huge impact on our business. Certainly not impacted our desire to invest. We've got to a point where actually, labs are now back open, and some labs actually stayed open throughout the entire the initial COVID outbreak. So for us, not hugely, not impacted our ability to invest, not impacted the ability of other investors to invest alongside us. I think that people are getting used to now living in a virtual world, a more virtual world, and it's becoming more acceptable than it was. And I know Henrik said he hadn't met the founders from France. I've only met one of the companies that we're currently in negotiation with several. I've only met one of the company's founders out of all of them, and it's no longer a bar for investing. So I think, not impacted as greatly. We have seen a slight impact for some of the companies, for some of the work on the ground. I don't think that COVID moving forward will materially impact them as much as it did back in March, when everything was new and people had to almost reinvent the wheel. I don't think we'll get there. I think we could see some slowing, but I don't think in healthcare actually it will impact. And I think as a whole, we're pretty excited of what will happen in healthcare over the next few years. I think it's a real boom area.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. So we're already getting close to the end of this. We've got 4 minutes left, but before then, I want to take just one last question from the audience before asking our panelists to give a final word. And although the second part of this question seems to, Daniel has said a couple of things about that, but let's also see if there's any addition. This is the reverse of what we've spoken before. Before we are looking at investors, this is doing due diligence on startups and all that. But this person have asked, as a founder, how would you do a due diligence on the person who's trying to invest in your own idea?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, and I don't think enough people have actually thought of that in the first place. So I think that's a really good place to start, is to even have that mentality of you have the right to ask an investor these sort of questions, and you really, really should. I think some of the key things to ask is how involved do you get as an investor? You want to figure out actually, A, do you want an investor to be involved? And then B, if you do, what are the gaps you have on your own team, and does the investor fill those? So something that we see a lot, for example, is people saying, look, we don't know really how to hire a team. Do you have any hiring experience? And that's something that we do have. So with those founders, it often makes a lot of sense to match up. That's one thing. I think, how do they follow on fund? What sort of capital allocation do they have to continue funding? So you don't get to a kind of awkward bridge round where you're having to bring in external investors, and the external investors don't understand why you're not following on. Is it because you think it's a bad company? And actually it's just because of the way your fund's structured. So that's really useful to clarify, so you know what's coming up. Knowing where the money comes from is important. Just to understand why the investors behind the fund are investing in this and what their expectations are. That really drives the investment decisions, and often is quite opaque. So that's probably another key point. And then I think just to understand who the people are. Like, we really put a big emphasis on all of our team meeting the founders relatively quickly, and vice versa. So that when you get to an investment committee, it isn't just an associate or a partner, whoever it is, presenting a company to people who don't know who those people are. And so I think at the earlier stage, getting an idea the transparent idea of how the process works, that's really important, and maybe a really good early indication of how that investor will work with you. But that's a few of many, many things you could cover. So yeah, that's just a couple.
Okay, that's great. Dan, has you got something to chip in as well?
Yeah, so I think following investing is important, because sometimes it's not the investor who follows, but the investors in the investor. So we have what are called recursive or step-in rights. So you're not necessarily limited by the investor at the table, and it can open the doors to bigger financing. I think it's important, actually. So I'm not going to repeat everything that Henrik said, which is all stuff I would absolutely agree with. I think from my perspective, Investors sometimes invest in cycles, so it's important to find out where an investor is in their fundraising cycle. I mentioned that most VCs have a 5-year investment cycle and an exit cycle. If they're investing right at the end of their cycle, it may mean that actually they're going to look to dispose of the shares quickly. So it's about that. So I'd ask where they are. I would be asking questions of what companies they've invested in before, what experience the team has. Actually asking them about, who actually might even diligence the opportunities for them, who they use, and building what Henrik said, what their process is, and how long that process can normally take, whether whether companies need external advice, whether they need later down the line, different sign-offs. The process is quite important, and every investor's process is different. So yeah, just adding to Henrik, I would definitely be asking those. And obviously the other main one we can't ignore it is average check sizes. We've answered ours, but some investors have a huge range, and well within your right to ask when they start, when they stop, and how much they can write for.
All right, great. So there are a whole lot to still talk about, but I'm sorry we're already at the end of this. And so I will just quickly give our panelists just a minute each to tell us one or few things as the last word. But before they say that, I just wanted to mention that they bring a whole lot of expertise to this panel, actually. Having been entrepreneurs themselves, they founded different businesses. Henrik actually founded the Meetup and Discover app. And then, of course, Dan is the co-founder of Start Codon, in question that we're talking about today. So if you could quickly just use 1 minute to summarize, give an advice to our audience, while also tapping into the fact that you have that entrepreneurial experience, you have that founding experience to found your own business, and then move on to do 1 or 2 things. Putting all those things together and every conversation we've had today, I would like you to give a 1 minute final words to our audience before we finalize.
Okay, you put us in the limelight, David. I wasn't expecting that. Look, I think everyone has to understand how they approach anything in life, right? Like it's one of those like learning journeys. And so for me personally, I like knowing where the edges of things are. I like to understand, where is the edge of the universe that I'm working in, so then I can figure out what am I best at, and then I can go deep on that. So from my experience, I wanted to figure out what it was like to set up a startup. I wanted to understand what it was like to invest in a startup. And I wanted to understand what are the technical skills you need on both of those sides. And so that's what my, rendezvous experience, my investment banking experience, my crowdfunding experience all led to. And now I've sort of realized what I love doing and what I'm good at, which is going deep on finding and diligencing and supporting startups. So that is obviously just me and my personal background. But I'd encourage everyone to, if they have an idea of not necessarily knowing what they want to do right now, but some maybe differing ideas, explore them to different extents, figure out where the edges are, and then that'll enable you with more confidence to kind of dive deeper on the area that truly does inspire you and gets you up on a Sunday morning.
All right, thank you so much. Dan?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's all about, there's several things, but if I was to summarize it, it's about finding, firstly, making sure that you really find out what your MVP is, your real frontline, what it is that you're offering as a product and as a person, because that's what people will buy into. So it's about to do that, being able to articulate it and say why the concept is investable first. I think the other piece that I would say is that be aware of how you come across as a person. Self-awareness is a really, really important attribute. It's very good to be focused, but you really do have to be accepting of other people's points of view, because you will pivot, and you can be focused and still be self-aware and self-reflective and accept that you are good at something and you're not good at other things. No one is good at everything. And there are, the reason that people flesh out their teams with people is because people are good at different things. And what I'm good at is not necessarily what Jason's good at. And certainly what Jason's good at is not what I'm good at. So it's about being self-aware enough to appreciate the journey you're going to go through, being aware that things will pivot and change, and be prepared to improve, because that is really important, both as a person and as an entrepreneur. And the final bit is, do not underestimate how long it takes to sometimes get financings off the ground. Timing, we thought that we would do this in a shorter period of time than we did in terms of our fundraise, because things will pop up, whether that be COVID, whether that be issues in terms of the market that you didn't perceive would be the right market, the same market you stepped into, whether the idea is fundable itself, etc. Give yourself time. Give yourself time. Make sure you plan things properly. Appreciate things might take longer than you think. And also try and have some fun, because if you're not having fun and you're not committed, you won't enjoy it, and it won't be for you. And the more fun you're having, the more you're committed, and the more you can drill down on those areas, I think will really add and really help to your journey as an entrepreneur, really.
Right, thank you so much, Dan. It's been an insightful evening. It's been an amazing evening to have both of you to share your wealth of experience with us. We really appreciate that. I would just want to say that West usually run a bi-weekly event, so every 2 weeks we run this event. So for Mekomas Town, we still have 3 events that are lined up for you. So you can always visit the Wolfson website and go to the West section of the website to see details of other events that we've lined up for you. And every time we'll always host them on Twitter, on Facebook, and on YouTube. So if you're on YouTube, try to subscribe and then follow us there. Follow us on Twitter, and as well as our Facebook page, so that you can remain in touch with us and get every information and every other project that we have. And just to also mention, we are planning to launch the Wolfson Enterprise Competition, which is going to give some money to some funders. I don't know, maybe you should call it pre-seed funding, but we are not going to take equity of your business. We're just going to support your idea at the end. So just look out for that. We are going to launch that before the end of Mekomas. It's probably going to take place in Lent term. And at that point, I would have to say thank you very much to our speakers and then to the audience. It's nice to have you guys. And I will have to draw the curtain at this point. So thank you, everyone.